Great. So thank you, David, for the warm intro and for inviting me to another edition of London Futurist. I want to kick off with a really exciting topic on regulation and the automotive industry, and something we're quite passionate about. So as David said, I used to work at IBM Watson, and since then moved to the investment side. Full disclosure, we invested in an autonomous vehicle company called 5.ai, and as a result, we spent kind of maybe 3 months doing a deep dive on autonomous vehicle. What are the drivers bringing them to market? Why are they a good thing? What are some of the industries that are going to get disrupted? But then what's the positive externality that's created from a world with autonomous vehicles? And so today I wanted to share a little bit of that research, particularly focused on regulation, why pushing for faster approval and government grants is something that makes sense for the UK, for the US. A lot of this data will be US-centric because they're a bit ahead of the game, and that's where we got some of ours. But this applies to the UK. But before we begin, something quite interesting is we often look at the autonomous vehicle shift as we looked at the transition from horses to cars. So if we'll talk about autonomous vehicles, and the conversation becomes, yeah, they're groundbreaking, yes, they're going to be innovative, but realistically, if my Uber has a driver or not, the difference is just going to be in cost reduction. It's not going to be that much of a quantum leap. And it's easy to kind of fall into this trap, but we'd argue that it's as if we had gone back 100 years or more and started talking to people about cars, and this idea of mechanical horses replacing some of the modes of transportation we have now. If we had said, well, what's the difference between having a carriage with a horse or driving a car? My driver is still going to just get me from point A to B. It's really not going to change my life that much. But the reality is, the moment you have a car, you no longer need a driver. It becomes a lot more democratized. The shape of a city completely changes. Look at the amount of muses we have in London that have been refurbished into completely gentrified homes. And then even more, it's more than a cost-saving shift. The very nature of logistics and transportation, and the fact that we can have containers that can easily move from a ship to an 18-wheeler truck, make it anywhere. From Rotterdam, you can be anywhere in Europe in about 6 hours now with a container. That completely changes the face of logistics, what we can do in terms of business, the cost that was brought down, and kind of this unknown of new use cases that opened up. And we kind of see autonomous vehicles changing that, but also the way we interact with cities. So most European cities completely reinvented their infrastructure to adopt cars. American cities that were built in the last century were completely built from day one around cars. And we can kind of see, in terms of logistics, infrastructure, public spending, the impact that that's had. Overall, it's been a positive impact. But the idea here is we think that the shift from autonomous vehicles from dumb cars is going to be as important as the shift from horses to cars, in the way that we interact with our cities, in the way that we do business, and as well as the positive externalities that implies, which will come in a second. So for cars, one of the positive externalities, which we don't necessarily think of, is the modern ambulance. The fact that you can have an emergency anywhere in a city, you can pick up a phone, dial a number, someone will pick you up in under 10 minutes, hopefully, and you can be treated immediately. In terms of extending quality of life for emergency situations, that was a drastic increase. Fire departments as well, policing, just being able to get those emergency responses in real time. But I guess taking a step back from the benefits of autonomous vehicle, let's just dive into why now? Why didn't we have autonomous vehicles 10 years ago, and why are things picking up quite quickly? So the first one really is electric vehicles. It's a lot easier to build an autonomous vehicle around an electric system with instant torque, which you can't really get with a combustion engine. But the interesting thing to notice about electric vehicles is we'd argue it's actually easier to go from dumb cars to autonomous vehicles than from combustion engine to electric vehicles. In an autonomous vehicle, unlike what we were thinking 15 years ago, you don't need to wire your city with sensors. It's really all going to be in the car, and the cost once it scales, isn't that huge. You don't need to build a new grid system. You don't need to have charging stations. You don't need to increase by 10x the world's lithium supply. You just need the sensors in the car. The second one, which we won't dive into too much because there'll probably be a few talks around AI and how that's changing the world, but it is the deep learning explosion from sci-fi and the Canadian mafia in the last, over the mid-2000s. Anything from the advent of GPUs being able to use data sets, GPUs to be able to train machine learning data sets, much more information coming for us, cloud computing giving you access to much more powerful computing, and a few other factors. The other one is sensor proliferation. So although autonomous vehicles, fully autonomous vehicles still don't exist commercially, the sensors that go into them have actually been creeping into our cars over the last 10 years. So think anything from being able to automatically park, cruise control, lane control, etc. Some of these sensors now are just becoming more numerous in our cars, but the economies of scale in actually making these cost efficient have already started. One of the big problems we have is LiDAR, which is quite expensive, can bring the cost of a car up by 15K. But we're seeing a number of startups in Europe trying to bring that by a factor down of 10x. So that's something we look at. And the last one, which I actually think is the most interesting and the most overlooked one, is ride-hailing. So these are apps like Uber, Lyft, or even BlaBlaCar, which will let you do car sharing. And what that's done, particularly around the millennial generation, is the idea of car ownership has completely eroded. Car sales are down by 20% from 18 to 25-year-olds compared to 10 years ago. The number of 18 to 25-year-olds even getting a driver's license is down 15% in the UK. So this idea that I need to buy a car as entering adulthood, I'm going to buy a car, is completely going away, and that's actually a good thing. When you think of it, a car is this huge capital expense you need to go into early on in your life. A car will spend 93% of its life parked. If you look at it on a per seat basis, there's only about a 2% utilization rate per seat in a car. It's completely inefficient. And then the amount of space that just takes up in parking, your stress, the insurance you need to get, just the economies of being able to share a car make a lot more sense for a country. And some of the ones that we don't quite mention are faster data. So for example, some of the tests Google was doing showed that the difference between going from 4G to 5G meant that you could detect an incident, make the right decision, act on that decision in 4.5 feet if you had to brake. The moment you move to 5G, you can do that in a matter of inches. So in terms of safety, that's quite interesting. And the last one is obviously growing urbanization. By 2030, 60% of the population lives in dense urban environments. It's a lot easier to connect all four of those in an autonomous vehicle that you don't own, that you're sharing if you're living in urban environments than if you're in the countryside. Who's involved in this? Everyone's involved. What I find particularly interesting about this chart is this, let's say, Munich, Detroit versus Silicon Valley. So just like with the combustion engine and Tesla, Detroit knew this would come along, but with all the R&D costs sunk into combustion engines, there was no real incentive to switch overnight. All of a sudden, new companies come along, traditional auto manufacturers realize they're no longer in control of a timeline. They need to stick with the future or they're gonna get left behind. Same thing happens with autonomous vehicles, where maybe 20 years ago, you would have asked someone who's gonna build autonomous vehicles, it would have been GM, Chrysler. Now people will probably answer Apple, Tesla, or Google. So this is pushing everyone. Some of these companies are facing a tough dilemma. If we move towards a world where companies sell you cards to providing a service, so it's no longer selling vehicles but selling mobility, just the idea of being able to get from A to B on a pay-as-you-go or even subscription basis, what is that going to do to General Motors? If one autonomous vehicle replaces 10 vehicles on a usage basis, car sales are going to plummet. Car ownership is going to seem like a thing of the past. And it's going to be interesting to see how these players adapt. Do players like Ford and GM become Foxcons, building shells that then Google can sell software into? Or are they going to try and follow the Apple model and sell you the hardware, the software, and the service that goes with it? We don't really know. Everyone's being quite secretive about it. Tesla is clearly doing this verticalized approach, and they've implied that car ownership, ride-hailing without ownership is going to become part of their plan, but we don't really know. So now diving into regulation, this is Mark Rosekind. He leads the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, and it's one of the government bodies that's pushing autonomous vehicles in the US. We wouldn't expect, let's say, from a regulatory body to be as pro-autonomous vehicle, but I think of all the changes that we're seeing, there's few events where either in the UK, in Singapore, in China, or in the US, government bodies are as pro in terms of this change coming fast. And it kind of makes sense when you think of the competitive advantage it'll give someone and some of the positive externalities we'll mention later. But to give you an idea, Mark Rosekind was appointed by Obama. He used to work at NASA. He has a computer engineering background, very smart guy. The US is putting in quite a few large investments into making autonomous vehicles happen. And the interesting thing to know is those 4 levels. So this is what we refer to when we look at autonomous vehicle, NHTSA levels 0 through 4. 0, dumb car, absolutely nothing. NHS level 1, you start to get some function specifics, so maybe cruise control or lane control. After that, you pair. So if you can pair cruise control with lane control, you can essentially take a step back on a highway, all the way to 4, which is fully automated. The difference is in how players will get from level 2 to 4, and that's where a lot of the regulatory approval is happening. For example, Tesla thinks that it's going to be a very linear path. We're going to go from 0 to 4, and we're going to have cars on the street that are going to be there early, collecting a lot of data, and therefore being able to improve themselves quite quickly. The problem is the moment some of your motor functions are delegated to the car, your attention span collapses, and if you're in a NHTSA level 3, where 95% of the time you're not going to do anything, and that event happens where you need a quick reaction time, it's the equivalent of being drunk, texting, and distracted at the same time. So it's this sort of, if you like, meta-level trolley problem. Do we assume that we're going to get to NHTSA level 5 by doing a linear approach, and that's going to be the fastest outcome? Or do we stay on level 2, do internal testing, do it in a lab like Volvo is doing, and the moment we feel comfortable with level 4, release it? If you're taking a purely utilitarian point of view, we're going to get to level 4 faster by going linear, and therefore that's what we should do, because if we're not discounting future human lives, then we're going to save more people by doing that. The counter argument is the moment we start getting a few accidents because people were distracted on a level 2 or level 3 vehicle, we might get a regulatory backlash, and that might actually stall the process even more. So a lot of the lobbying is happening at those levels. Can we release vehicles where humans are disconnected most of the time, but something wrong could happen that requires the human to provide an input? There's been a few talks about the accident Tesla had where someone died, unfortunately. But if you look at the amount of miles that are driven in autopilot versus the amount of miles that a car drives until someone dies on average, autopilot is still higher. So the trick here isn't, can we reduce all human casualties in a car? Because it's probably never going to happen. The question is just, can we build a vehicle that's better than a hairless primate driving a ton of steel with fuel in it? The answer is probably yes. But we just kind of have to be aware of the fact that it's not going to be from 3,500 people dying in a car crash every day. So that's a few 737s going down. Or are we okay with just harm reduction, assuming that a few people will die in autonomous vehicles? That's the main debate we're having at the moment. So yeah, some of the advantages to autonomous vehicles are, on average in Western countries, you're giving people an hour back of their day, which in the US alone is $320 billion lost. On a daily basis, that's 5 737s going down. And the main thing I kind of take from this is over the next 20 years, we're pretty much going to have to double the number of cars in the world to remain on pace with globalization, modernization. The amount in infrastructure costs that global GDP is going to have to spend is insane. With autonomous vehicles, with one vehicle replacing 10 cars, we can make cars that are much more efficient, use a lot less energy, and at the same time diminish the need for additional infrastructure for our roadways. And when you look at a US city, 30% of space is just parking. If you could all of a sudden have autonomous vehicles that don't need to be parked, or at least not in the traditional sense, you could give 30% of a city back to urbanization and better projects, as opposed to now where we're probably going to have to sacrifice another 10-15% to make space for vehicles. Why are autonomous vehicles safer? Well, they don't sleep, they don't drink, they can talk to each other, they're aware of 360-degree awareness, and all in all, they just keep getting smarter with every interaction. The trick is just how quickly can we get there. So I guess the main takeaway here is, as we were doing this study, this is our office at the end of that street. A few years ago, it used to be a parking lot. Before that, it was a muse. And when we see that transition of, well, what are autonomous vehicles really going to do for us? I don't think we have an answer. It's the unknown unknown. We're going to do something that can make something 10x faster, safer, and better for us. What does that mean for urbanization? Is there going to be an advantage to living and paying a premium to live 2 minutes away from a subway station? Will, brick and mortar store really survive when I can just have 20 items delivered to my house, choose which one I want to keep, ship the rest back, and the whole process costs 5 cents? And the thing that excites me the most is kind of this transition from the digital world to the physical world, where from the internet we went from shifting data packets that were running through a decentralized network, broken down, choosing the path of least resistance, and it was quite interesting. We can see that happening with logistics again. So I need to ship a good from A to B. I don't care how it gets done. It gets picked up on an Uber, sent to an 18-wheeler, goes to Rotterdam, ends up in Tokyo, and then does the reverse until it gets to my friend's house. If you can do that a lot cheaper, it starts to look a bit like internet protocols, and it could be really exciting. So I guess my closing arguments would be the road to autonomous vehicle will entail a few deaths, but it will definitely save more lives. The question is, looking at headlines, can we keep facts straight, realize that ultimately the positive externalities are going to be too good to let go? But yeah, I'd be curious to know what you guys think. What are some of the ways that we can kind of mitigate the backlash from the inevitable first few 10 or hundreds of deaths we're going to get from autonomous vehicles, and understand how we can convince the general public that this is ultimately one of the best things we can do for our cities and for our way of life. Thank you for your time.
That's great, Alex. There are some questions in here now. I'll take the top-ranked question, and it says, will the public really be able to accept the reality of decisions being taken by artificial intelligences on who lives and who dies in these crash situations? And it's referring to the MIT Moral Machines site on the ethics of autonomous driving. The view is that this is scary and people are going to go yuck, and they say, no, we really can't cope with this. Will people actually be bought into a comfort with that level of thinking?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting one there is it needs to be decided at a government level. So there's this whole, for example, Mercedes published something saying that in a car crash, the driver would always be prioritized. So, we really do get into a trolley problem where you're driving, your brakes cut loose, there's 50 people in front of you or a wall to your left. What does the car do? Does it just take a left, smash into the wall, and kill the driver, or does it go into the crowd of 50 people? Really tough choice. Hopefully these are choices autonomous vehicles aren't going to have to make that often. It's a choice we would have to make as a driver, hopefully. But when someone like Mercedes says, our priority will always be for the driver, it's a bit narrow-minded. Of course they're going to say that now. It serves no purpose. I mean, they're way behind on the race anyway, so by the time they're able to build an autonomous vehicle, it won't really matter. But it is it is something worth talking about. I think if we're worried, though, about putting our responsibility in, let's not say an AI, just a machine, then we need to rethink, are you really comfortable with getting on an airplane in the first place? Because that's what we're already doing.
So in which countries will autonomous vehicles be approved first?
So Singapore was the first country to have autonomous vehicles tested in public spaces. So the startup called Nutonomy is doing that. Uber is testing some in Pittsburgh, but right now there's about 15 states in the US that have legal frameworks in place to define what is an autonomous vehicle. The good thing is the companies that are in the autonomous vehicle race have enough cash to have said, we'll fully insure the vehicles ourselves. We take full responsibility as soon as the car is in autopilot, which was the biggest regulatory debate. So that's off the table, which is good. So I'd probably say safely the US will be the first ones to have autonomous vehicles regulated and in place commercially.
Well, as we know, the future arrives in waves, and whilst we're focusing on the next wave, the next but one wave may be something we should concentrate on as well. So there are a couple of people who have voted up. What do you think, not only about self-driving cars, but self-owning cars? That's cars which are running maybe a blockchain algorithm, and they're self-owning and they execute smart contracts. Is that something that's going to be impacting the real world anytime soon, or is that just a techno fantasy?
I'd probably go more for the techno fantasy. I don't see why, in a world where building cars really entails economies of scale, I would buy a Tesla, send it onto the streets, get some income through a distributed system powered by a ledger, where it could just be General Motors in partnership with Lyft owning 200,000 cars in the UK, repairing them, furnishing them, no longer needing to market them in the way that they were before. I don't quite believe in the decentralized model. I think the economies of scale are just too strong, and it'll be a few actors controlling them.
And more on how to win over people who might be skeptical about this future. Don't people love driving? How are you going to get them to stop driving? Because it's such a passionate, exciting, Top Gear kind of thing that we all aspire to.
So I'd say it's really interesting because especially in the Western world, and in particular in more conservative parts, so if you look at New York versus Texas, for example, people in New York don't really seem to care that much if they're driving or not. People in Texas really do. It's a bit like owning a horse. It goes from being a necessity to a hobby. I don't take my horse out to go to work, but maybe going to the stables makes sense. I could see a great business in the future being owning private raceways. You could see luxury sports cars jumping up in value and becoming, a hobby that people take. But when you look at China, which is, the Chinese government is really looking into autonomous vehicles, autonomous buses connecting cities. The idea of being driven is actually prioritized over driving. It's seen as a status symbol. And it's not a thing where, my parents had a car, my grandparents had a car. In China, you don't necessarily have this kind of cultural ingrainment of owning a car is a good thing. So I think we'll take some time to get used into it, but I just with these arguments just replace car with horse, and you can kind of see where the market's going.
We've time for one more question. Maybe I can ask Anna, the next speaker, to come and get ready. It's another question about politics, and so I think it's one that's worth looking at. The view is that most of the car companies who are developing this technology are doing a lot of it in secrecy, in a very competitive way. What chance is there that public fears can be mitigated by these companies being much more open about their thinking and their moral decision-making processes?
Interesting. I guess there's inherently an advantage to being public in terms of just letting your researchers publish versus not doing so. And I'd look at outside of the autonomous vehicles, just look at the AI race in general. So compare Apple to Google or Facebook. Apple doesn't let its researchers publish publicly. They're way behind these other companies. Whereas Yann LeCun, publicly made it clear you can't hire the world's best if you're not going to let them publish. That's their entire capital as an individual. And I think that, sure, at first I can understand the secrecy. GM buys Cruise for $1 billion. They're not going to share it overnight. But there does come a point where the true gains are going to be on who has the data, who works on it the most, and a bit less on the core fundamental principles, which won't get commoditized per se, but won't be as unique in 4 years. What gets really interesting is when all these protocols as to how cars talk with each other need to be connected. So if I'm driving down the road and right behind the curve there's a pothole, maybe my car barely dodges it, but if then that car sends a signal to every car on the network, we avoid the pothole and we're safe. For that to happen, there needs to be this sort of common framework between all manufacturers. So I think that's when they start collaborating a bit more.
I think this issue of competition and secrecy versus openness and possibility of common good is one that's going to come up again and again throughout the day.
So let's say thank you very much, Alex.
Thank
You've
you.
done a great job. And
Here we go.